As you may have heard by now, my new book, The Two Swords of Christ, about the Knights of the Temple and Hospital and their savage wars against Islam, is less than 3 weeks away from being released. Now, by way of preparation, I wanted to briefly discuss the logic and rationale, and most importantly, the theology that gave rise to these two brotherhoods. So let's take a look at the seminal document of the Templars, history's first Christian military order. Titled In Praise of the New Knighthood, it was written by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, shortly after the formal recognition of the Knights Templars in 1129 AD. It begins by showing that the Templars do indeed represent a new but also much needed creature, the fusion of monk and warrior, so that the two realms of Christian warfare that had hitherto been separated, the incorporeal and corporeal, or spiritual and secular, could be confronted by the selfsame warrior monk. In the words of Bernard, this is a new kind of knighthood, and one unknown in ages past. It ceaselessly wages a twofold combat against flesh and blood and against spiritual hosts of evil in the heavens. That latter part, of course, is a reference to Ephesians 6:12. Nothing, Bernard continues, is new or shocking about warriors who fight their foes with might and main, or of monks who combat demons through fasting and prayer. But for a man to powerfully gird himself with both swords, spiritual and secular, and mark his belt with the cross, who would not consider this worthy of great admiration, even more so since it has hitherto been unknown? Truly, a fearless knight and secure on every side is he whose soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by armor of steel. Doubly armed, surely he need fear neither demons nor men. Not that he fears death, no, he desires it. Why should he fear to live or to die, when for him to live is Christ and to die is gain? March forth confidently then, you knights, and with a stalwart heart repel the foes of the cross of Christ. Be sure that neither death nor life can separate you from the love of God, which is in Jesus Christ. As shocking as Bernard's words may be to modern-day Christians, they are also logically consistent. Consider, if it is acceptable to fend off Satan's fiery darts against the soul, why is it not acceptable to fight off the enemies of Christianity who terrorized Christians not just with fiery darts, but with swords, spears, and cruelty unbounded? Indeed, although forgotten today, both swords, mentioned by Bernard, are a reference to Luke 22:38, where Christ told his disciples that 2 swords are enough. For pre-modern theologians, this was Christ's way of legitimizing 2 forms of warfare, one with a spiritual sword against spiritual enemies, and one with a physical sword against physical enemies, also known as just war. Thus, nearly a century after Bernard, James of Vitry, the Bishop of Acre, preached of how Saracens and pagans undermine the peace of Christendom, tyrants and evil Christians attack the liberty of the church, and false brothers undermine love. Against the violence of the pagans and Saracens, it, the church, uses the physical sword, hence the Crusades. Against tyrants and false brothers, it uses a spiritual sword. Since the church has 2 swords, which the Lord said is enough, one is to be exercised in a spiritual sense by the prelates, the other by the princes and military Christians. James of Vitry went so far as to assert that, quote, only heretics argue that it is not Christian to fight, and cite scripture to prove this. They, lying, assert that it is not permissible for you to take up a physical sword, nor to fight bodily against the enemies of the church. They abuse the authority of the scriptures and present petty reasons. And if we did not resist the church's enemies, the Saracens and heretics would have already devastated the whole church. In fact, knighthood was set up in order to repel violence, repulse injuries, and exercise justice on evildoers. Not much has changed, eh? I can just see and hear all the doormat Christians wringing their hands and whining about how unchristian it is to repel violence, repulse injuries, and exercise justice on evildoers, to quote James of Vitry. Anyway, returning to Bernard of Clairvaux, this important spokesman for all military orders went on to argue, as St. Augustine did before him, that fighting, even killing, are not intrinsically evil. Rather, it's the intention and motivation of the fighter that decides the matter. Bernard continues, indeed, danger or victory for the Christian are weighed by the focus of the heart, not the fortunes of war. If he fights for a good cause, the outcome of the battle can never be evil. And likewise, the result can never be considered good if the cause is evil and the intention unrighteous. There go the overwhelming majority of modern-day wars, the intentions of which, if you only really knew, are seldom righteous. The new knights, Bernard said, were engaged in malicide, not homicide. Their purpose was to exterminate evil, not evildoers, who in this context were seen as collateral damage. In the saint's own words,
"Surely, if he kills an evildoer, he is not a man-killer, but, if I may so put it, an evil killer."
Bernard goes on to compare and contrast the new knighthood with the secular and by then quite ostentatious knighthood. Not only do the latter fight and kill for vain, unchristian reasons, for fame, gain, vengeance, or from wrath, but they dress effeminately, said he, and ornament themselves and their horses with baubles befitting the trinkets of a woman, his words. In stark contrast, the Templars and other military orders had a decidedly manly look and austere outlook. Along with going against Frankish custom by refusing to shave and letting their beards grow long, apparently in keeping with God's design and therefore will, they, quote, cut their hair short, cognizant that, according to the apostle, it is shameful for a man to cultivate flowing locks. Bernard is here referring to 1 Corinthians 11:14-16. He continues, when battle is imminent, they, the Templars, protect themselves inwardly by their faith and outwardly by iron, not gold, so that, armed and not adorned, they strike fear into the enemy rather than arousing his greed to plunder them of their trinkets. They seek to have strong and swift horses, not ones decked out in many colors. They are intent on fighting, not pomp, victory, not glory, and they strive to inspire terror, not admiration. Worse, because the secular knighthood fight and kill for, in Bernard's words, slight and frivolous reasons, including irrational anger, empty glory, and earthly possessions, it is for them not safe to kill or be killed, as hell would be a possible consequence. In contrast, the Knights of Christ may safely do battle in the battles of their Lord, fearing neither the sin of smiting the enemy, nor the danger of their own downfall, inasmuch as death for Christ, inflicted or endured, bears no taint of sin, but deserves abundant glory. For the record, the idea that Christians who die fighting for the faith are martyrs far predates Bernard and even the First Crusade in 1095. It actually goes back to at least the mid-800s, under Popes Leo IV and John VIII, and was widely accepted by most Western European theologians. In the words of William of Tyre, the 12th century chronicler, we believe indeed that those who fall in the ranks of the faithful, fighting with the warriors of the cross for the name of Christ, deserve that not only disgrace, but all derelictions whatsoever be erased from their records. None of this, of course, was seen as a license to kill. Bernard insisted that Muslims should not, quote, be slaughtered when there is any other way of preventing them from harassing and persecuting the faithful, end quote. However, because Muslims had, for centuries, proven themselves existential, intractable enemies to Christians, it now seems better to destroy them than to allow the rod of sinners to continue to be raised over the lot of the righteous, lest perchance the righteous set their hand to iniquity. He was referring to the then well-known fact that, to escape persecution, lots of Christians had converted over the centuries. If, as Bernard continues to argue, Christians are not forbidden from fighting, provided it's for a just cause, then they must certainly stand up to Muslims who, from the start, had waged and continued to wage a wholly unjust war on Christendom. No room for cheek-turning here. Surely then the nations who choose warfare should be scattered. Those who molest us should be cut away, and all the workers of iniquity should be dispersed from the city of the Lord. Those who busy themselves carrying off the incalculable riches placed in Jerusalem by Christian people, profaning holy things and possessing the sanctuary of God as their heritage. He's referring to the Muslims. Let both swords of the faithful fall upon the necks of the foe, who represented both secular and spiritual evil. Let both swords fall on the neck of the foe to the destruction of every lofty thing lifting itself up against the knowledge of God, which is the Christian faith, lest the Gentiles should then say, where is their God? For Bernard, even the Templars' headquarters, Solomon's Temple, or Al-Aqsa Mosque, underscored the muscular, no-nonsense side of Christianity. For was it not at the temple that Christ himself engaged in righteous violence, argued the saint. The facade of this temple is now adorned with weapons rather than jewels, and in place of the ancient golden crowns, its walls are hung round with shields. In place of candlesticks, censers, and ewers, this house is well furnished with saddles, bridles, and lances. By all these signs, the knights clearly show that they are animated by the same zeal for the house of God, which of old vehemently inflamed the leader of knighthood himself, Christ, who, having his most sacred hands armed, not with a weapon, but with a whip which he had fashioned from lengths of cord, entered the temple, ousted the merchants, scattered the coins of the money changers, and overturned the chairs of the pigeon vendors, considering it totally unfitting to defile this house of prayer by such traffic. Moved therefore by their king's example, his devoted soldiery, the Templars, considering it far more unfitting and infinitely more intolerable for a holy place to be polluted by unbelievers than to be crowded with merchants, have installed themselves in this holy house with their horses and their armor, having expunged it and the other holy places of every infidel stain and the tyrannical horde. They occupy themselves day and night with work as distinguished as it is practical. They honor the temple of God earnestly with fervent and sincere worship, in their devotion offering up not the flesh of animals, according to the ancient rites, but true peace offerings, brotherly love, devoted obedience, and voluntary poverty. For Bernard, the lifestyle of the Knights of the Temple, both in peace and war, is, quote, an exemplar, or at least an embarrassment for those of our knights who are apparently fighting not for God, but for the devil. End quote. Abiding in perfect discipline and obedience, the Templars, Bernard continues, live in cheerful community and sober company, without wives and without children, so that their evangelical perfection will lack nothing. They dwell united in one family with no personal property whatever, careful to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. They never sit in idleness or wander about aimlessly, but on the rare occasions when they are not on duty, they are always careful to earn their bread. There is little distinction of persons among them, and deference is shown to ability, not to nobility. They rival one another in mutual consideration, and they carry one another's burdens, thus fulfilling the law of Christ. No arrogant word, no idle deed, no unrestrained laugh, not even the slightest whisper or murmur is left uncorrected. That said, once the call to battle is heard, these seeming saints turned into raging devils. Or in the more restrained words of Bernard, once in the thick of battle, they set aside this earlier gentleness, as if to say, "Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Am I not disgusted with your enemies?" This is a reference to Psalm 138:21. These men charge the enemy, regarding the foe as sheep. Never, no matter how outnumbered they are, do they see them as awesome hordes. Nor do they presume on their own strength, but trust for victory in the Lord. For one man may pursue 1,000, and two put 10,000 to flight. This is a reference to Deuteronomy 32:30. This then was the riddle of the Templars. They appear gentler than lambs, yet fiercer than lions. Consequently, I do not know if it would be more appropriate to refer to them as monks or as soldiers, or whether it would perhaps be better to recognize them as being both, for they lack neither monastic meekness nor military might. What can we say about this, except that this is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes? Okay, there it is, the logic and theology that gave rise to the Templars, history's first Christian military order. For the full story of the Templars, consider pre-ordering the Two Swords of Christ, or to get an advanced signed copy, see the link in the description.